I am married and we have a daughter. I love my husband, I really do, but circumstances led me down a path I never thought I would take. I betrayed him, though not out of malice or desire, but rather out of a deep and gnawing sense of loneliness. The man I was unfaithful with wasn't a stranger. He was someone my husband knew, someone who had been in our lives, perhaps too close for comfort. My husband is in prison, serving a sentence of 4.5 years for drug possession and trafficking. And before anyone casts stones or judges my actions, I ask only that you take a moment to hear my story. It all began 10 years ago. Like so many love stories, ours seemed simple at first. We met, fell in love, and soon after, decided to share a life together. In those early days, everything felt right. We laughed, we dreamt, we spoke of the future as if it were something we could mold with our hands. There was an easiness to it, a warmth that wrapped around us, shielding us from the world. But as time passed, the cracks began to show, and I came to know him not only as the man I loved, but as someone far more complicated, far more broken than I had imagined. It started with small things, mood swings, long silences, and erratic behavior that I couldn't quite explain. At first, I thought it was stress, maybe the weight of responsibilities that neither of us were fully prepared for. But soon, I discovered the truth. He was using drugs. Different kinds, at different times, and each one seemed to pull him deeper into a darkness I didn't know how to reach. He had no steady job, no purpose beyond the four walls of our home. Most days, he would sit idly, lost in whatever haze the substances provided him, while I worked and tried to hold everything together. It was a slow, suffocating realization that the man I thought I knew had another life, one that I had never seen coming. His mother and I became allies in this silent war. Together, we fought to pull him out of the abyss he had willingly stepped into. We tried everything: support, patience, interventions that felt like endless battles against an enemy we couldn't see. At times, it seemed hopeless, as if he were drifting too far away from us, from the future we had once imagined together. But for a while, it worked. We thought we had won. There was a period of calm, a stretch of time when things felt as though they were finally changing for the better. He stopped using. Slowly, I began to believe that we had reached the other side of this dark chapter. There were no more hidden pills, no suspicious late-night disappearances. The man I had fallen in love with seemed to return, piece by piece. It was during this time that I became pregnant. I will never forget the moment I told him. The look on his face, pure, unfiltered joy. He was ecstatic, like a child given the greatest gift. He held me close, laughing, crying, talking about all the things we would do as a family. For the first time in so long, hope bloomed in my heart. This was it, I thought. This was the turning point. We began to plan for the future again, not the dreamlike future we had once envisioned, but a real, tangible one. We talked about names for the baby, where we would live, how we would raise our child. It was as if the shadow of the past had finally lifted, and we were walking into the light, hand in hand. But even as the months passed, and I watched his excitement grow with each day, there was a part of me that remained cautious. I had seen the other side of him, the part that could spiral back into darkness without warning. I didn't want to believe that he could fall again, but the fear lingered, a quiet whisper in the back of my mind. By the time I reached 7 weeks of pregnancy, I had already quit my job. It was a decision that came easily, even though I knew it would leave me without a stable income. But the baby growing inside me was more important than anything else. My job had been hazardous, with a low salary that hardly made ends meet. Bringing my daughter into the world safely became my priority. While I stepped away from work, my husband, seemingly more driven than ever, threw himself into his job. He worked tirelessly, pushing himself to exhaustion. But soon enough, everything started to unravel again. At first, I thought he was simply adjusting to the pressures of impending fatherhood. But then it began, slowly at first and then all at once. The old habits, the friends I had hoped he'd left behind, the drugs. It all returned with a force I wasn't prepared for. It felt like watching a car crash in slow motion, knowing you can't stop it but being unable to look away. His mother and I tried, once again, to pull him out of it. We had been down this road before, thinking we could help him, believing that this time might be different. But no matter how hard we fought, it was as though the grip of addiction was stronger than us. Exhausted from years of struggle, we let things run their course, each of us retreating into our own spaces, hoping something would change on its own. He continued to work like a mule, laboring day and night, but the money never reached our hands. Every cent he earned vanished into the abyss of addiction. I saw none of it, just more signs of his destruction. I couldn't take it any longer. I packed my things and moved in with my mother. I needed a place where I could feel safe, where I could prepare for the birth of our child without the constant cloud of chaos hanging over my head. His mother left too, choosing to spend the summer at her country house, away from the madness. It was as if, with both of us gone, my husband completely let go. Our home became a refuge for his so-called friends. They would swarm the place, bringing filth and trouble with them. The apartment became unrecognizable, a far cry from the home we had once tried to build together. Every time I returned to gather more of my things, I was met with the wreckage they left behind. The stench, the mess, it was overwhelming. I would kick them out, furious and heartbroken, then scrub the walls of our bedroom, desperately trying to reclaim some semblance of normalcy. But it was futile. He was never really there, at least, not the man I had once known. Under the influence of whatever substances he was on, he was volatile, unpredictable. He would shout, scream, and sometimes even lash out, like he had in the past. The pain of his anger would hit hard, like a physical blow, but the emotional wounds cut deeper. And yet, after every outburst, there would be apologies. His voice would tremble, full of regret, as he begged for forgiveness. I wanted to believe him each time. There was always that part of me that remembered the man who had once held me so close, the man who had wept with joy when he found out we were going to be parents. But with each apology, the cracks in our relationship deepened, and the space between us grew larger. It became impossible to bridge that divide, no matter how much I still cared for him, and so, our lives continued in this strange, fractured way, him trapped in his own world, and me, preparing to bring our child into a world that felt increasingly uncertain. I loved him deeply, with a love that seemed boundless, enduring through every trial, every misstep, every promise broken. I forgave him, again and again, each time hoping, praying, that this time things would change. But my hopes were always in vain. He had made his choice long ago, and no matter how much I wished otherwise, he was lost to a world I couldn't reach. Then came the day that would change my life forever, the day I was taken to the hospital to give birth. The excitement I should have felt was clouded by a quiet fear, a nagging feeling that things weren't as they should be. My daughter arrived with some complications, nothing too serious, but enough to make those early moments filled with worry. And then he came, my husband, in a rare moment of clarity. He was sober, his eyes alight with joy as he saw her for the first time. She was his mirror image, right down to the smallest details. He seemed proud, genuinely happy, and for a fleeting moment, I allowed myself to believe that maybe, just maybe, this would be the turning point. He came for the discharge from the hospital, standing by my side as we left together with our daughter cradled in my arms. I dare to hope that this new life, this innocent being we had created together, might finally be the catalyst for change. Perhaps he would finish the renovations in the apartment. Perhaps he would return to work, stay away from his destructive habits, and focus on the family we were meant to be. But hope, as it always did, dissolved into disappointment. Soon enough, the same old patterns emerged. His friends slunk back into his life like shadows, bringing with them the drugs, the chaos, the oblivion that always followed. He would disappear for days on end, lost in a haze of addiction, unreachable and unreachable. Each time, I would search for him, tracking him down to the drug dens where he wasted away. One night, in one of those dark corners of his addiction, something inside him snapped. In a moment of senseless rage, he lashed out, and the blow landed hard across my face, breaking not just my skin, but something far deeper. My trust, my faith, it shattered in that instant. I went back to my mother's house, the only safe space I had left. But even in the wreckage of our relationship, he still came to see our daughter. I could see it in his eyes, he loved her. There was no denying that. When he looked at her, I saw glimpses of the man I had once known, the man I had fallen in love with. But love alone wasn't enough to pull him from the abyss he had fallen into. And then, one day, the phone rang. It was the police. He had been arrested, and through the broken words of his call, he asked me to bring his passport. I didn't know what was happening, but I went, carrying our daughter in my arms. I waited at the station, anxious and confused. After what felt like an eternity, they released him. He came to me, his face streaked with regret, eyes pleading. He begged for forgiveness, swore he had changed, promised that this time, it would be different. He had seen the error of his ways, he said. He wanted to make things right. And as I stood there, holding our child, a storm of emotions raged within me. Could I trust him again? Could I risk it all one more time? Once again, it was all in vain. Despite every promise and every hope I had clung to, he found himself back in trouble, and one day, he ended up in pretrial detention. It was a grim, inevitable outcome, but no amount of preparation could soften the blow when it finally came. I started visiting him regularly, dragging with me the heavy bags of supplies, each one weighing close to 30 kilograms, funded by the small stipend I received for our daughter. Every spare cent went to close his debts, pay off loans, and keep things afloat. He suggested that we part ways more than once. I suppose he thought it was the noble thing to do, to give me an out from this endless cycle of despair. But in my heart, I couldn't let go. Out of some twisted devotion, or perhaps from an unshakable belief in the love that had once bound us together, I refused to leave him. Our daughter was still less than a month old, a tiny, fragile life that needed both her parents, or so I convinced myself. I won't delve into the depths of the emotions I experienced then and continue to experience now. The grief, the exhaustion, the overwhelming sense of isolation, they are too raw to articulate, too complex to fit neatly into words. I was alone. Alone with a newborn baby who demanded every ounce of my energy, patience, and strength. Neither my mother nor his offered any help, and I carried the weight of it all, our daughter, the endless prison visits, the expensive parcels and supplies, the long conjugal visits, the mounting costs of his incarceration. Day by day, I felt myself unraveling. It was as though the life I once knew, the dreams I had nurtured, were slipping through my fingers like sand. The baby, my precious girl, she hardly slept. Nights were endless cycles of her crying and my attempts to soothe her. We visited doctors, searching for answers, for some medical reason to explain her restlessness, but they found nothing. She was healthy, they said. But something in me felt broken. And then, one day, I hit my breaking point. I realized that I couldn't go on like this. I had reached a place of such profound exhaustion, both physical and emotional, that I no longer recognized myself. I was a shell of the person I used to be, drained of all joy, all vitality. I needed to escape, if only for a moment, from the relentless pressure that had become my existence. I needed to step away from the crushing responsibilities, the demands of motherhood, and the never-ending burden of his imprisonment. I made a choice that day, a choice to seek release, even if only for a few fleeting hours. I knew people would judge me. They would look at my situation and wonder how I could think of myself when I had a child to care for. They would condemn me for wanting, for needing, a reprieve. But what they couldn't understand, what no one could truly grasp, was how utterly worn out I was. How I had reached the point where survival meant finding some way, any way, to breathe again. So I decided to let go, to forget, if only for a night. A year after my husband was imprisoned, the weight of it all became too much for me to bear. I found myself in a place I never imagined I would be, betraying the man I had once loved so fiercely. Despite everything he had put me through, he still professed his love, still whispered promises of change, telling me he had realized his mistakes, that he had finally seen the light. But something in me no longer believed him. I wanted to, perhaps, in some distant part of my heart, but the trust had eroded. Love? Yes, that stubborn thread still connected us, but it was tangled with fear, resentment, and doubt. Fear that, if he ever found out, he would kill me. Fear that there was no coming back from what I had done. I was alone, truly, desperately alone. A young child in my arms, no money, no help, nothing but the cold silence of those who had once called themselves friends. Even my own family had turned their backs on me, as if my life had become too messy, too complicated for them to handle. I found myself pleading with strangers online, mothers like me, asking for baby food and clothes for my daughter. It was humiliating, soul-crushing, but I had no other choice. And then came the unexpected connection, a lifeline of sorts, in the form of one of my husband's old acquaintances. It started innocently enough, just a message here and there. Casual conversations, small talk about life, about how things had fallen apart for both of us. He had just gone through a divorce, and though he had his own struggles, he made a point to stay involved in his daughter's life. He took her in whenever he could, and that was something I admired. One evening, our conversation took a different turn. He wanted to meet in person, to talk face to face. His suggestion came at a time when I was particularly vulnerable, when the weight of my world felt unbearable. My daughter's grandmother had agreed to take her for a few hours, giving me a rare moment of respite, and so I agreed. I don't know if I even thought it through properly. Maybe I just needed the distraction, the illusion of being seen, being heard by someone who wasn't judging me. And so, the moment came. He arrived that evening, and we sat in the quiet space, the weight of both our lives heavy in the air. His voice was steady, though I could sense the weariness behind it. He shared the difficulties of his own life, the struggles of being a single father, of losing the woman he had once thought he would spend his life with. And as he spoke, I couldn't help but feel the walls around my heart cracking under the pressure of my own pain. I had been carrying the burden of my circumstances for so long that it all came crashing down at once. I wept long, choking sobs that felt as if they would never stop. I poured out everything, the agony of being alone, the exhaustion of fighting a battle I felt destined to lose, the despair of loving someone who had destroyed so much, yet whom I could not let go of. In the midst of my tears, my husband called from prison. We exchanged a few words, a habitual argument over things that felt meaningless, but still cut deep. I hung up, feeling raw and fragile, and cried even harder. And then it happened. It wasn't premeditated, but I knew, deep inside, that I had wanted it. In that moment, I let the grief and anger, the loneliness and confusion, push me towards something I could control, something that made me feel alive for a moment. The sex was not about love, not even about desire, but about a need for escape. For just one night, I wanted to feel something other than emptiness. The man who had come to comfort me became my release. He left after it was over, without promises or expectations. I was left with the echo of my own decisions. Almost immediately, the guilt set in. I couldn't escape it, the nagging feeling that I had crossed a line I could never return from. My husband, despite everything, despite the drugs, the lies, the violence, I still loved him. I couldn't explain it, but he had a hold on my heart that wouldn't let go, and now I had betrayed him. I reached out to the friend again, desperate for reassurance, for something to ease the gnawing anxiety inside me. He was calm, almost indifferent, and told me that it didn't matter. It was just sex, he said. You needed help, and I helped you. No one will ever know. His words were meant to soothe me, to reassure me that nothing had changed, that life would go on as before. But I couldn't shake the guilt. The next time I went for a long visit with my husband in prison, the weight of my secret felt unbearable. In a moment of strained humor, I half-jokingly hinted at what had happened, telling him that maybe something had occurred while he was away. I don't know what made me do it. Maybe I was testing him. Maybe I was testing myself. His reaction was indifferent, as though he didn't take me seriously. And in that fleeting moment, I felt a strange sense of relief, as if by half-confessing, I had lifted the burden off my chest. It wasn't the full truth, but it wasn't a lie either. Still, the guilt remained, like a shadow that followed me everywhere. I live in constant fear that one day my husband will walk through the doors of our home, free from prison, and discover the truth I've been hiding. It gnaws at me, the secret, like a parasite burrowing deeper into my heart, threatening to consume everything I am. And yet, I continue to speak to the man who became my momentary escape, exchanging polite hellos, asking how things are, pretending that nothing has changed between us. Our conversations are brief, superficial, but every message from him serves as a reminder of my betrayal, of the night that has left me tangled in guilt. I don't know what to do. I am lost, trapped in this impossible cycle of loyalty, love, and deceit. My mind spirals endlessly, searching for answers where there seem to be none. I ask myself over and over again how I ended up here, how I became the woman who waits for her imprisoned husband while carrying the burden of having broken her vows. I betrayed him, and yet I still cling to the hope that when he comes home, things will somehow go back to the way they were. I go to visit him, I bring him what he needs, I stand by him through all of this, but inside, I am breaking. Each trip to the prison, each phone call, is like a reminder of the weight I carry, and I don't know how much longer I can bear it. At night, when the world is quiet, I cry into my pillow, desperate for a release from this crushing feeling of helplessness and despair. I feel trapped in my own life, trapped by choices that I can never undo. My daughter, barely a year old, is my only source of joy. I hold her close, feeling her soft breath against my skin, and wonder if she can sense the turmoil that's raging inside of me. She is too young to understand, too young to be sent to daycare, and so I am with her always, every minute of every day. But even in her innocent eyes, I sometimes see a reflection of my own pain. I wonder what kind of mother I am, what kind of future I'm creating for her in this mess of a life I've built. I don't know where to turn. My friends, my family, they've all distanced themselves, perhaps sensing the weight of my mistakes or perhaps simply growing tired of my endless struggles. I am alone in this, and I have no one to confide in, no one to share the burden of my guilt and fear. So I turn to strangers, to anyone who might listen, who might offer some form of guidance or comfort, even if it comes in the form of judgment. I know what I've done is unforgivable, and I expect no sympathy. I have no illusions about that. But still, I find myself reaching out, hoping that someone might help me understand what to do next. I've betrayed the man I love, and yet I continue to wait for him, to help him, to stand by him as he serves his sentence. I am a walking contradiction, torn between love and guilt, loyalty and deceit. I don't expect anyone to understand, and perhaps that's why I've been silent for so long. But now I've reached the edge of my endurance. I need help. I need advice, even if it comes wrapped in harsh words and judgment. I need someone to tell me how to carry this weight, how to move forward when my heart is so full of regret. I've made my bed and I know I must lie in it. But how do I face my husband when he returns? How do I keep pretending that everything is okay when inside I'm falling apart? I wait day after day, hoping that the answers will come, that the pieces of my broken life will somehow fit together again. But as I sit here, watching my daughter play, I know deep down that the road ahead will only grow harder. I don't know how long I can keep going like this, how long I can keep hiding from the truth. But for now, I continue. I wait and I hope. And I pray, in the quiet hours of the night, that God will forgive me, even if my husband never can.